Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Josh Holbrook with the Against the Grain podcast coming at you, rolling solo tonight. Got a topic we've covered before, but it's in the news again. A bunch of new information coming out, and again, we're going to talk about Epstein. It is the story that does not seem to ever want to go away. And as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't need to go away. It's not something we need to push to the side. It's something that needs to be brought to the forefront. It needs to be brought to the forefront because it seems everyone on every level of government and in elite society was connected with this guy. These files are massive, and we surely haven't had all of it fleshed out yet. 3 million documents were released. Certainly, I haven't gone through the half, but I've absorbed a lot of material through people that really have been on this for a long time. Still currently reading Whitney Webb's books. I need to get through those to have the full scope of understanding of all of the research that she did. I recommend those highly to anybody. Also, listen to several podcasts on the topic. One between Tucker Carlson and Ian Carroll's great. Mike Benz is probably the other person out there in the world who has the most to say about Epstein and goes deeper than most when it comes to the money and what Epstein was involved in throughout his tenure of being a public figure. And we're going to talk about some of that today. I'm going to try to stay away from some of the details, however, on the Epstein files themselves. And I want to talk more about what it means overall. You know, it reminds me of a George Carlin quote. It's a big club and you ain't in it. And it shows that so many people who are celebrities or politicians or bankers or of any kind of money or fame or import are all connected to this guy. And some of the names that were in the Epstein files are Larry Summers, Reid Hoffman. Reid Hoffman financed a bunch of the Democratic Party campaigns and funded a lot of donation dollars to all kinds of Democratic candidates in the 2024 election. Mark Andreessen, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, so a bunch of the PayPal mafia guys. Bill Gates, obviously, we've known for years, but some of the stuff that came out specifically about him was even dirtier than what we had previously known. There was a ton of stuff, but the most salacious was probably that he contracted STDs from prostitutes, apparently, and was talking in email to Epstein about how he could possibly get antibiotics to his wife without her knowing so that he could cover it up. What a scumbag. I mean, he's a scumbag on many, many fronts, if you ask me, but that one is just another level for him. Steve Bannon, turns out, was deeply connected to Epstein. There's tons and tons of text messages and emails that seem like good buddies. One of the things that just makes me really mad about the way that these files have been released is that we have tons of people, 6 prominent people that have been talked about by Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna, the Congress people that really pushed this bill to get this stuff released. They talked about stuff they've seen in private of the unredacted 6 public figures that their names were redacted for no given good reason at all. I mean, why are we redacting people's names just because they're public figures or government figures or celebrities? We shouldn't be. The only ones that should be redacted are victims. And they messed that up too. They released information on some of the victims in there. And so they're still covering up for powerful people when it comes to Epstein and people's involvement with him. And it just, there's no reason for it except that they want to keep their club. They want to keep the people, normal folks, out of it so that we aren't able to see what goes on behind the scenes because we would be outraged. And I am outraged. I have been outraged. This gives us a little peek behind the curtain. These files, these most recently released files, gives a peek behind the curtain of who's involved in what and how deep the rot goes, really. But my position on Epstein is, the more that as time goes on, is that the sexual deviant stuff was only the part of his poor character that got him caught. Most of what he did was about being a money launderer for powerful people, for powerful interests, for big oil, for intelligence agencies, and he was somebody out there working the dollars. As we covered before back in the previous Epstein podcast that we did, Epstein considered himself a person who could make dark money disappear or find illicit funds that had been stolen. He could hide illicit funds, and that was what he called himself a financial bounty hunter back in the 80s. So for whatever that means. But he was involved in some of the biggest scandals that we've had in our country, including Iran-Contra, He got his start at the Dalton School after he dropped out of college. He somehow secures a professorship at the Dalton School, which is one of the most prestigious private schools in the nation. He got hired on at the Dalton School by Donald Barr, father of Bill Barr. Bill Barr was heavily involved in all kinds of things in our government going back to the 70s, including being a member of the CIA for a while and also being heavily involved in the Church and Pike commissions, and then also advising George H.W. Bush when he was being questioned by Congress when it came to the Iran-Contra affair. Bill Barr has been involved with Epstein on some level throughout his time as a public figure. And it just strikes me, Donald Trump's attorney general, who was in power when Epstein supposedly was killed in prison, was involved with him from his entire tenure moving forward. It wasn't a loose connection either. There's more stuff on Bill Barr that I discovered as I started to research this. Speaking of Bill Barr, he was in the CIA from 1971 to 75, and then he was the Office of Legislative Counsel from 76 to 77. And in that later time period under the Office of Legislative Counsel, he was doing things like prepping H.W. Bush for his testimony in front of congressional committees when it came to Iran-Contra. He, during this time, developed this idea and ideology that he strongly believed in executive privilege and limiting Congress's ability to have oversight when it comes to intelligence matters. And then later on the stuff when it came to Iran-Contra. Iran-Contra, for people who are not super familiar with it, was in the 1980s, and it was a behind-the-scenes scheme that was put together by Oliver North and several other folks, including Adnan Khashoggi, who was an international arms dealer, was a Saudi national. And what they did is they took U.S. weapons, funneled them through Israel, and sold them to Iran, despite sanctions that we had against that, and then took those funds and supported Nicaraguan rebels who were fighting against the Sandinistas government. It was a big, big controversy. There's lots that I don't know about Iran-Contra, but what I do know is that Epstein and his relationships with all these people we're talking about was deeply involved in Iran-Contra because of his ability to hide finances. So his role in that was that he was there to come in and clean up the books and make sure that it was hard for people to follow the money and hard for people to pin this activity on these public figures that were involved. Didn't work, obviously. It came to light. But just to give you an idea on Iran-Contra, it was about 64 to 100 million in estimates of what was facilitated mostly by Adnan Khashoggi, who was an international man of mystery, if you want to use the Austin Powers line. But he had this reputation for being a high society guy with connections across the world when it came to politicians, elites, bankers, and he was deeply tied in with Robert Maxwell. They were not only friends, but Maxwell highlighted him several times in his publications and continued to build on this air of being a high society person who had access into all kinds of things. Douglas Leese was a British arms dealer who was also involved in Iran-Contra. Between Khashoggi, Leese, and several other players, these weapons were funneled to the Iranians, paid for through loans to an international bank called BCCI. There's a ton on BCCI. It was a super corrupt international bank. It was started by a Pakistani, and then it was supported by a bunch of the Gulf Emiratis and Dubai, Saudis, U.S., and basically what it became was a bank that financed illicit operations for intelligence, for things like Iran-Contra. It hid money for drug cartels. Anything that was off the books and needed to be hidden, that's what BCCI was doing. That later on, I think it was about 1971 when it was founded, and about 91 or 2 is when it went completely out of business through all its different scandals. BCCI is another big rabbit hole I didn't really want to go down, but it's just something that's key to the story, and anybody who's doing their own research on this, that's one you could really look into. Bill Barr advocated for expansive presidential discretion in foreign policy, and he argued against strict requirements for CIA to not have to notify Congress about covert operations. In his mind, he thought the president was the one that should always be the one weighing in on intelligence matters, covert affairs. And then when Iran-Contra was over, Bill Barr pushed for pardons for all of the people who had been involved and who had lied to Congress. He did the same when it came to the Church and Pike commissions before that. He pushed for pardons. So he was fully in support of letting people off the hook for lying to Congress and being involved in illicit activities. He thought the president should have the ability to just let any of those people get away with it, or not have to stand trial for it, or not have to face any consequences for it. The Church and Pike commissions in the 70s, 75, 76 is when those were going on. They shined a lot of light on nefarious activities that the CIA was doing, spying on U.S. citizens, illegal activities, operations that were just running wild all over the globe. And they were really reined in. They had clearly been spying on Americans, and they got reined in by the Church and Pike commissions. That's another whole data set. When you look into the Church and Pike commissions, they're not necessarily part of where I want to go tonight. What I want to talk about is what has happened since then. And what happened since the Church and Pike commissions is that CIA, NSA, other intel agencies realized that they could not continue to officially run these programs outside of their mandate. So they had to do it in such a way that it wouldn't be able to be tracked. And the way that that was done was through the NGO system. Right now, we have tons and tons of NGOs that our government funds on an annual basis. It's just in digging into some of that, annually, there are 100 to 150,000 U.S.-based groups that receive funds from the government annually. 350,000 groups in total. Not USAID is one that took a lot of heat in the beginning of Trump's term under Doge. The USAID had a bunch of corporate executives plead guilty in 2025 to about a decade-long bribery scheme involving $550 million in contracts where bribes were paid to secure the awards. So these fundings for NGOs are not only just grants, but they're contracts and other things like that. And so NGOs are where all of the money goes to make it much more difficult to track, and for intelligence agencies to be able to use money how they see fit without congressional oversight. Other allegations in 2025 from congressional hearings and investigations claim money laundering schemes where taxpayers funded NGOs hire former Democratic officials at high salaries or funnel resources to politically connected individuals. Groups affiliated with Stacey Abrams received $2 billion amid prior fines for campaign finance violations. $2 billion went to Stacey Abrams related groups. And that's just one person. Government-wide, the GAO estimates that 233 to 521 billion in annual federal fraud losses. So the American system is just bleeding out from fraud. And a lot of it is just going toward the NGOs, being funneled to programs that the intelligence agencies want to run without any congressional oversight. And the way that this ties back into Epstein is that he helps a lot of these organizations, or had helped a lot of these organizations hide their money and hide where it goes. Roll a bit back towards some of his involvement with Bear Stearns. When he first got on with Bear Stearns, and how that happened is another interesting story. He had been this teacher at the Dalton School. He had been let go for poor performance, but really Ace Greenberg, who was one of the chair people at Bear Stearns, who had a child there at the Dalton School, had been introduced to Epstein and wanted him to come to work at Bear Stearns. So he was let go, and then he came right over to Bear Stearns. And one of the first opportunities they put him on was securing deals through BCCI back in 1979. And so his first foray into big-time finance was involved with an international banking organization whose stated job, looking backwards, was to finance illicit operations around the world for anybody who did not want to be above board and wanted their money to be hidden. So he broke into that world through a legitimate company Bear Stearns, mostly legitimate at the time. But what was going on behind the scenes was a lot of illegitimate actions, and he was right in the thick of it from the very beginning. So he stopped working for Bear Stearns along the way, but then at some point he was still putting himself out there as someone who worked for Bear Stearns and acting like he still worked for them. Another thing that happened through Bear Stearns was that they are one of the companies whose collapse helped precipitate the 2008 financial crisis. And there was one of their large funds that was in the mortgage game that was heavily leveraged. Epstein had put in $57 million in an investment there, and as he must have seen the writing on the wall, he tried to pull that money in 2007, couldn't get it out. The fund was so heavily indexed that it was losing all its money. That fund went completely broke in 2007, so he didn't get his money out. Then in 2008, Bear Stearns completely collapsed. JP Morgan bought him for pennies on the dollar. And then subsequently, Epstein sues JP Morgan over his lost money in that mortgage fund that was the same type of mortgage fraud that was going on across the industry that precipitated the 2008 crash. He sued JP Morgan for some big amount of money. I believe it was the full $57 million, and settled out of court for $9 million. So Jeffrey Epstein wins a lawsuit, gets $9 million. A bunch of these bankers get bailed out by our government, while normal people get left holding the bag. Normal people lost homes. Normal people lost their retirement. Normal people didn't get much help at all from the government when the financial crisis was going on in 2008. But all of these elites got their hand held, got grants, got bailed out. Bankers especially got bailed out. It's another sign of that big club that you and I are not in, that they are. And it doesn't matter how poorly they perform or what laws they break, they're going to be bailed out, and or they're not going to be held accountable. And that's what we see in the entire Epstein story. That's what encompasses the whole thing. It's the reason that it's not going to go away as a story. It's the reason it shouldn't, is because right now, Lady Liberty and the scales of justice are not blind. They see if you have money and you're connected, you can do what you want. And this comes in all forms and all different parts of our society. A few years ago, we had a scandal where a bunch of folks lied and did a bunch of things on their kids' transcript and donated a bunch of money to help them get into these big schools. And people actually went to jail for it. A couple of celebrities went to jail for it. And they should. But it's very, very rare in our society or in the world when people who have lots of money or power face any consequences for their action. And that is the big part of the Epstein story that is all encompassing and reflects on all of us. It reflects on society. It's something that we all ought to pay attention to. And I think people are rightly sick and tired of the double standards. And that's why this story is not dying. And that's why the government has made a huge misjudgment when it comes to this thing. Donald Trump has made a huge misjudgment when it comes to this thing. And in trying to make it go away, they just have made themselves look terrible. Absolutely awful. And we've gone with Kash Patel, who has made a fool of himself, and Dan Bongino, who's made a fool of himself, talking about how before they were in public office and before they were connected with the FBI, that we should never let these stories go, stay on this story. Kash Patel was going to release the files on day one, blah, 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 all these promises that they made. And when they got in there, everything changed and it went back to the government line. Oh, he killed himself. Yep, he killed himself. There are no files. That's another thing Kash Patel said repeatedly. There are no files. The government just released 3 million. How's that looking for you, Kash? You should step down immediately because of saying outright lies like that. You should be done. That's not how Trump works. Trump works on loyalty. He's loyal to people who are loyal to him. So I don't see anybody in his administration facing any consequences for this. Trump's in there too, a lot. His name is mentioned a ton in the Epstein files. But what I have not heard anybody talking about is anything new. It was well known that they were seen together fairly often in the party scene in New York, that they were friends. It's also well known they had a pretty major falling out at Mar-a-Lago, and the rumor mill has it, or I don't know if there's tons of evidence to back this up. It was possibly over Virginia Giuffre, who was working for Trump, and then Epstein plucked her and took her off and into his world, and it made Trump really angry, and he booted Epstein from Mar-a-Lago. But partisans on both sides are trying to twist this to say that the other side, the side that they don't like, is more heavily involved than Epstein. That's not it. They're all involved. All the elites, all of the high level politicians, except for very few, were involved. There's tons. And what irritates me to no end is that nothing's happening about it. Another reason Kash Patel should resign, and so should Pam Bondi, is there's been no indictments and no arrests and no pressure put on politicians or people in any kind of power in the United States. You know, the UK has got its own problems. But what's happened since the Epstein files release here, this most recent release, is that a ton more has come out about former Prince Andrew, and we knew he was a pretty big scumbag, and he had already had his titles stripped and been disgraced in every way possible. But it's bringing even more pressure on the royal family now. They also have a guy named Lord Peter Mandelson who had leaked sensitive information about dealings in the British government to Epstein. This was already known, and then Keir Starmer hired him anyway. And it talks about, when the stuff that I was reading, about a rotten nexus around Keir Starmer when it relates to Epstein. The current prime minister is currently fighting for his political life in the UK because of these Epstein files. Contrast that with what's happening here. Nobody is being held accountable. Nobody has lost their job. Nobody has been arrested, and nobody's been indicted. For those reasons right there, Pam Bondi and Kash Patel should resign in disgrace. It's just terrible to, on one hand, live in a country like the United States, believe in what it's supposed to stand for, freedom under the law, and then turn around and look at things like this, and there's nothing that's equal about how you and I would be treated if we broke the law versus how political elites and celebrities are treated when they break the law. If a person without connections, who's not powerful and without money, did something illicit with an underage person, girl, boy, doesn't matter, and were caught, they would be buried underneath the jail. They would have 20 years minimum. And these folks, the elites, all this, they're just able to get away with it. And it makes it extremely frustrating. And my hope is that these two major parties who've been in power for so long will continue to crumble. In my opinion, they're already dead, and they don't even know it. They're walking corpses. I've said that plenty of times. But I hope that this crumbling facade turns into an avalanche and it just washes them both away. We need new leadership. It is beyond time for the 80-year-olds to move it along and let younger folks into the places of power and into government. It's also beyond time for people who are not connected to power to get into positions and expose the stuff that's been going on behind the scenes for years. I don't know that that's going to happen right away, but things are shifting wildly. The midterms are coming up, and it looks like the Republicans are just going to get smashed. That's what most of the polling says. And look, I'm not a partisan. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I try to vote for anybody down the middle. Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna are heroic in what they've done here. Marjorie Taylor Greene, didn't like her at first, but she really showed up, and I wish she had rode out this storm and stayed in, because she was showing herself to be someone who is trustworthy and not bought out. Unlike most of these politicians, Ilhan Omar, of course, but many, many others, of course, Nancy Pelosi, of course, Dan Crenshaw, so let's keep it on both sides, Mitch McConnell, most politicians have a very small personal wealth, net worth when they get into politics. And then shortly thereafter, they're worth millions and millions of dollars. It's obvious corruption sitting right in front of us. And we allow it to go on by continuing to vote these people in. Take off the team jerseys. Just because you happen to vote for Trump this time doesn't mean you should sanction what he is doing here with these Epstein files or even some of the other stuff that he's doing. Some people are not in favor of what he's doing with ICE. I'm right down the middle on that one. It's another topic for another time. But if you wear a Democratic jersey, stop it. Take it off. Look at these issues individually as they happen. Don't look at it through a partisan lens. People are viewing all kinds of things through a partisan lens. It's awful. The Super Bowl is another one that just happened, and this people making a big controversy where there shouldn't be one over the Bad Bunny halftime. Because people were making a big deal about it, I wanted to watch it even more. I didn't really have any interest in Bad Bunny. I heard of him only because he was going to be doing the Super Bowl. TPUSA decided to do this alternate halftime, and frankly, I have no interest in Steven Tyler and Kid Rock and the rest of the people that were going on there. I never really liked much of their music and could care less. I could care less really about Bad Bunny, but I just wanted to see why people were so outraged. It was a little bit out of place, but it shouldn't be something that people are all up in arms about. The reason it was a little bit out of place is because most of the people watching speak English, and it was in Spanish. Music was kind of catchy and whatever, and the visuals were cool. I liked the way that the performance was set up. I liked a lot of the visuals. There was some parts, especially toward the end, that were a little bit overtly political toward the immigration stuff, but okay. Whatever. It's not that big a deal. It wasn't more overtly sexual than a lot of Super Bowl performances I've seen. There was a couple of scenes of guys dancing on each other pretty hard, which I could have done without, but all in all, it was a big shrug to me. Like, okay, kind of decently fun, upbeat sound music. Could have danced to it a little bit if you were so inclined, but I didn't see much wrong with it. And I think it's really stupid that people make a big cultural divide over every single issue. And this Epstein one should be one we all agree on. Anybody who messes with kids should, in my world, be lined up against the wall and shot. But if you want to send them to jail, go ahead, send them to jail. But most people are going to agree that anybody who does awful things to children should face major, major consequences and should never be allowed back into polite society again. You shouldn't be able to run for office. You shouldn't have any standing whatsoever. Hopefully you're forced into the shadows forever, even if you're not in jail. But that's just not where we are. There's been no consequences. It doesn't seem like there's going to be consequences unless we keep pushing on it. But it's something we ought to keep pushing on. Something we ought not allow in our society. We shouldn't allow people to do all that they want to with whoever they want to with underage girls and just get away with it. It was awful. But again, I want to go back to the behind the scenes financial matters. It's really what's clogging up the entire system. We have fraud everywhere. We don't manufacture anything. Social Security is insolvent and going to tear our country down financially even more if we don't do something about it. And we're allowing people to just rake millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, through NGOs, through people like Epstein. And I say people like Epstein because I'm sure that there are many more people who do the same kinds of things in financial crimes, fraud and money laundering, and all the types of things that he was into for the elites, for the intelligence agencies, and just don't have his sexual proclivities. And so they don't get caught. What are we to do about that? Should we just focus on the sexual stuff because it's egregious, because it's terrible? You can't let any of that stuff go. But the bigger deal to me is that we have to get the money out and the money cleaned up. Follow the money is something that investigative reporters have said from time immemorial. It's what we ought to do here is always follow the money. There's much more going on here with all these NGOs, other folks. We really need to continue pulling on these threads and see where it goes. There's a phrase that's been said to me more than a handful of times by people who are close to government. And it goes like this: if the people really knew what went on behind the scenes, there would be rioting in the streets. Well, now we've been shown behind the curtain. We see what's going on behind the scenes, at least in part. We should be rioting in the streets over what our government is into. We should be rioting in the streets over wars that don't need to happen, wars that have the interest of other countries involved. Here we are on the precipice of war with Iran again, and we have no interest in it. There's nothing in it that would help our country at all. It seems to be at the behest of Israel. Netanyahu's due to come into Washington for, I think, what is his 10th time, 9th or 10th time in Trump's first just over a year in office. Why in the world are we having him need to come here 10 times unless he's attempting to, or even successfully, influencing our foreign policy? We don't need war with Iran. There's nothing there that's in our interest. And people make big accusations of anti-Semitism anytime you bring up something to do with Netanyahu or Israel. And there's a big difference between anti-Semitism and speaking on the actions of a government. Any other government in the world, you can say your opinions about, you can speak on what they do, and there's no charge of any racism of any kind. But if you speak against anything that Israel's doing or any of their interests, you get accused of anti-Semitism, especially if you do it publicly. I don't hate anybody of any color, ethnicity, religion, but I definitely disagree with the Netanyahu government, disagree with their handling of what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank. And I don't think we need to be in lockstep with them and what they want to do foreign policy-wise. And Iran is the last of the 7 countries on the list that was given to us by General Wesley Clark back in his day, when it was talked about how we're going to war with 7 countries in 5 years. Back at that time, it was a long time ago. It's taken us a lot longer than the 5 years, but we've definitely gone to war in all of those countries. We need to back it off. We need to not be the world police. We need to not require the services of some financial fraudster and money launderer like Epstein. So where do we go from here? I think we keep pushing. I think we don't let up on Epstein, and we don't let up on our government and the things that they do, the politicians do, that organizations do, the NGOs do. We need to keep pushing. We need to keep pulling this open. We need to keep asking questions. We need to keep digging through the files. But this was more about some of the financial stuff that goes on that Epstein was involved in. And sexual stuff is how he got caught. But the financial stuff is where the rot has its root. It's where it comes from. The money, it's been said many times that the money is the root of all evil. And it certainly can be when let run wild. So I'd love to know what people think about Epstein, what their takeaway is from the docs that have been released. I'd love to hear what other people have come up with. And I'd love to talk more about it with anybody who'd like to go down that path. But thank you for checking it out tonight. This, again, is the Against the Grain podcast. If you enjoyed the discussion, please give us a like, a share, a subscribe, pass it to a friend, leave us a comment. It'll all be appreciated. All right. Thanks for checking in. Josh Holbrook, signing out.